I set the lasagna on the table without saying a word. My son was already talking before I even sat down. Something about interest rates, something about how unfair everything was, how they'd tried so hard. His wife sat next to him, nodding along the way she always did, her fork picking at the food without really eating it. My grandson was in the living room watching cartoons, which was fine by me. He was 6. He didn't need to hear any of this. "Dad," my son said finally, cutting through his own rambling, "we need to talk about the situation." I picked up my glass of water. "Sure," I said. That was Thanksgiving. It wasn't the first time we'd had that conversation, but I didn't know yet it was going to be the last. Let me back up a little. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working for the county assessor's office in Maricopa County, Arizona. Property valuation, documentation, appeals. People think that's boring work, and mostly they're right. But what it teaches you, and this took me years to understand, is how to read paperwork. How to spot when numbers don't add up. How to stay calm when someone is sitting across from you, absolutely certain they're right, and you can see plainly that they're not. My late wife Helen used to say I had ice water in my veins. She didn't mean it as a compliment exactly, but I took it as one. Helen passed away 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and brutal, the way that particular disease tends to be. One week she was complaining about back pain. 4 months later she was gone. My son was 32 at the time, already married to his wife for 2 years, already expecting my grandson. Helen got to meet him once in the hospital 2 weeks before she died. She held him for about 40 minutes and cried the whole time. Happy crying, she told me, the best kind. After Helen died, I rattled around in our house in Tempe for about a year. 4 bedrooms, a pool that needed constant maintenance, a yard I had no interest in. My son, his name is Patrick, called me every Sunday. His wife Tammy called less often, but when she did, she was warm enough. Concerned, she'd ask how I was sleeping, whether I was eating right. Looking back, I wonder if that was when the plan started forming in their heads, or maybe there was no plan at first. Maybe it just grew naturally the way debt tends to grow, incrementally, one small decision at a time, until one day you look up and the number has become something you can't ignore. Patrick and Tammy had bought a townhouse in Gilbert 2 years before Helen died. Nice enough place. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, decent neighborhood. They'd stretched to afford it. Patrick was in sales, Tammy did something in marketing, and together they made decent money, but they spent like they made twice as much. New cars every 3 years. Vacations. A kitchen renovation that I thought was unnecessary but didn't say so. That wasn't my business. What became my business was when Patrick called me in February, about 14 months after Helen passed, and said they were having some trouble. Some trouble turned out to mean they had refinanced the townhouse to pay off credit card debt, then run the credit cards back up, then taken out a personal loan to cover a gap, then borrowed from Patrick's 401k, and now they were sitting on a combined consumer debt of somewhere around $220,000, not counting the mortgage. I remember sitting in my kitchen when he told me this. The afternoon light was coming in through the window over the sink. I had a cup of coffee in front of me, which I didn't touch for a long time after he finished talking. "How long has this been building?" I asked. "A while," he said. "Does Tammy know the full picture?" A pause. "We've talked about it." That pause told me everything. I didn't yell. I didn't lecture him. I asked him to send me the statements, all of them. Credit cards, loan documents, the 401k withdrawal paperwork. He seemed almost surprised that I wasn't angrier. He emailed everything over that night. I spent the next week going through it the way I used to go through property assessment appeals, methodically, line by line, and the clearer the picture got, the quieter I got inside, which has always been how I work. What I found was not just debt. What I found was a pattern. Minimum payments made consistently enough to avoid collection calls, but never anything more. Small cash advances that didn't correspond to any stated expense. A personal loan from an online lender at 22% interest that they'd used, as far as I could tell, to fund a trip to Cabo. The math told a story, and the story was that Patrick and Tammy hadn't fallen into hardship. They had built themselves a life they couldn't afford and then continued building it, one swipe at a time, for years. I called Patrick the following Sunday and said I thought he and Tammy should come over for dinner so we could talk. They came on a Thursday. I made chili, nothing fancy, just what I had. Patrick was nervous. Tammy was nervous but better at hiding it. She complimented the chili twice and asked if I wanted to come visit for Christmas. I said that sounded nice. Then I told them I wasn't going to pay off their debt. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when someone has been expecting a different answer. Patrick recovered first. He started talking about how temporary it was, how they had a plan, how if they could just get out from under the interest payments they could start fresh. Tammy reached over and put her hand on his arm and said quietly, "Patrick." She understood before he did. I said I loved them both, and I loved my grandson, and that none of that was going to change. But I'd spent 30 years watching Helen and me save carefully and thoughtfully, and I had a responsibility to that money and to my own future, and I wasn't going to write a check to make a problem disappear that would simply reappear if the underlying behavior didn't change. Patrick said, "So you're saying no?" "I'm saying no," I said. They drove home. I washed the dishes. The house was very quiet. What came next happened slowly and then all at once. The Sunday calls stopped. I'd call Patrick and get voicemails. Tammy's warmth on the phone dropped away. My grandson's birthday came in April, and I sent a gift card and a card, and Patrick texted me a thank you that was 2 words. I drove out to Gilbert for Easter and sat at a table where the atmosphere was polite and distant in the way that's somehow worse than an argument. I kept showing up. That's what I decided I would do. I wasn't going to chase them, but I wasn't going to disappear either. Then in August, Patrick called me on a Wednesday, not a Sunday, and said that they'd gotten a notice from their lender. Not the mortgage lender, one of the personal loan companies. He said they were thinking about selling the townhouse. I said that might be a smart move, depending on where the market was. He said the equity might not cover everything they owed. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said, "Dad, we're kind of out of options." I asked him what he meant by that. And here's where it started. Not Thanksgiving, not the big confrontation. Here, quietly, on a Wednesday in August, while I was sitting in my truck in a parking lot outside a hardware store. Patrick said that he had been thinking, that he and Tammy had talked, that they felt like, given everything, given that I had the house and the savings and no real expenses of my own, that maybe it would make sense if I helped them out. Not all of it, just enough to stabilize things. I asked him how much stabilize things meant. He hesitated. Then he said, around $150,000. I told him I needed to think about it. And then, and I want to be clear about this because the timeline matters, instead of thinking about it the way he expected me to, meaning instead of eventually coming around, I spent the next 2 months quietly doing something else entirely. I called a financial advisor I trusted, a woman named Mrs. Okafor, who I'd been working with for 6 years. I had her do a full review of my assets and what a withdrawal like that would actually cost me over the next 20 years in compound growth alone. She came back with a number that made me put the phone down for a second. I called a real estate attorney and updated my will and trust, which Helen and I had originally set up together but hadn't touched since she died. I called a locksmith, not for any dramatic reason. Helen and I had given Patrick a spare key to the house years ago, the kind of thing you do without thinking, and I decided it was time to think about it. I did not tell Patrick any of this. What I did instead was stay present. I called on Sundays again. I drove out to Gilbert twice. I took my grandson to a Diamondbacks game in September, just the 2 of us, and we ate too many hot dogs and he fell asleep in the car on the way home, and I carried him inside and thought about how none of what was happening between me and his parents was his fault at all. Thanksgiving came. Patrick and Tammy had them at their place that year. Her parents drove in from Flagstaff. Her mother was pleasant. Her father and I watched the game together, and he fell asleep in the recliner before halftime, which I respected. It was a normal enough afternoon until after dessert, when Tammy's parents started clearing the table, and Patrick touched my arm and asked if we could talk for a minute. We went into the back bedroom. Tammy came too. Patrick sat on the edge of the bed. Tammy stood near the window. Patrick had a folder. I recognized the type of folder, manila, the kind you can get in a bulk pack from any office supply store. He opened it with the deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this. Inside were papers. I could see credit card statements, a letter from a collection agency, what looked like a modified mortgage statement. He said, "Dad, we're at the point where we need an answer." I said, "An answer about what?" Tammy said, "We talked to someone, a financial counselor. She said the realistic option at this point, given our situation and given your assets, is for you to pay off the debt." I said, "Pay off the debt?" "Yes." "All of it?" Patrick said, "The high interest stuff first. The credit cards and the personal loans, that's about 180,000 now. The rest we can manage if those are gone." I looked at the folder. I looked at my son. He was 40 years old, and he was sitting on the edge of a bed holding a folder, the way a kid holds a permission slip, half defiant and half ashamed of himself, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as grief, not for the money, but for the thing that was happening to us in that room. I said, "That's a big number." Patrick said, "You have it." And there it was, the core of the thing finally said out loud, "You have it," as if having it was the same as owing it. Tammy said, "We're not trying to take advantage. We just know that you have more than enough, and we're family, and family helps family." I thought about Helen. I thought about what she would say. And I think I've thought about this many times since. I think she would have been furious, not at me, at the idea that the word family could be used that way, like a card you play when you've run out of other moves. I said, "Let me think about it over Christmas." Patrick looked at Tammy. Tammy looked at me. "Christmas," Patrick said. "Dad, we have payments due in January." "I understand that," I said. "I'll have an answer for you at Christmas." That gave me 4 weeks. Those 4 weeks were the most useful 4 weeks I've had in recent memory. I called Mrs. Okafor and gave her my final instructions. I called the attorney and confirmed everything was in order. I wrote a letter, not an email, an actual letter, typed and printed and signed, that I kept in the inside pocket of my jacket for the next 4 weeks, because I wanted it close. Christmas that year was at my house. My invitation, which I'd extended back in October before any of this came to a head, and which they'd accepted. I cooked a prime rib. I made Helen's green bean casserole from the recipe card she'd written in her handwriting that I keep in the drawer by the stove. I set the table with the good dishes. My grandson had gotten a remote control car for Christmas and spent most of the afternoon crashing it into the furniture, which was fine. He's 6. That's the job. After dinner, Patrick brought out the folder. Same one from Thanksgiving, or one that looked exactly like it. He set it on the table between us and said, "You said you'd have an answer." "I do," I said. Tammy said, "We really need you to say yes." I said, "I have something for you." I went to the hall closet where I'd put it that morning. A large envelope, the kind with the clasp on the back. I brought it to the table and set it down next to Patrick's folder. "Go ahead," I said. Patrick opened it. Inside was a letter from my attorney, which I had asked her to draft in plain language. It explained that I had updated my estate documents, that my assets, the house, the savings, the investments, were now held in a trust with specific distribution terms, that I had made my intentions clear regarding my estate, and that those intentions did not include settling any pre-existing debts belonging to my son or his wife prior to my death. It also contained a budget my financial advisor had put together, showing what my retirement income covered and what it didn't, with a note at the bottom that said, "In Mrs. Bay." Okafor's precise and professional language, that any significant withdrawal at this stage would materially impact my long-term financial security. And then there was one more document, a lease agreement. My son looked up from the papers. I said, "I've thought about this a lot. I love you. I love Tammy. I love your son more than I can say, but I'm not going to pay off your debt. What I am willing to do is this. If you need to sell the townhouse, you can come here, all three of you, but it would be under a lease. Fair market rent, reduced by 30% because you're family, month to month, with a clear timeline and expectations in writing. Patrick said, "A lease." "A lease." Tammy's voice was careful. "You want us to pay you rent?" "I want us to have an agreement that protects all of us," I said, "including you, including me, and especially him." I nodded toward the living room where my grandson was still crashing his car into the baseboard. Patrick pushed back from the table. He said I was treating them like strangers. He said he couldn't believe I would do this to them. He said a lot of things, some of which I absorbed quietly, and some of which I'll admit landed harder than I expected. Tammy cried. Not the way people cry to get a reaction, but the quiet kind, where tears just come out while the rest of your face stays still. That was harder to watch. I said I understood they were disappointed. Patrick said, "Disappointed? Dad, we're drowning." I said, "I know, and I'm sorry, I genuinely am, but I didn't create the water." He was quiet for a long time after that. They left earlier than planned. My grandson hugged me on the way out, too young to know what had happened, just following his parents to the car. He had a piece of tinsel stuck to his sleeve. I stood in the doorway and watched them back out of the driveway. The house was very quiet. January came. They sold the townhouse. It took about 6 weeks, and the equity after closing costs and the remaining mortgage balance wasn't enough to cover everything. They worked out a settlement with 2 of the credit card companies and made payment arrangements on the personal loans. It wasn't easy, I know that. In February, they called and said they'd looked at apartments and the ones in their price range were either too small for the 3 of them or in areas they weren't comfortable with for their son's school district. Patrick asked if the lease offer was still on the table. I said it was. They moved in on March 1st. My grandson picked the bedroom with the window that faces the backyard, which was his right as the only 6-year-old in the house. Patrick and Tammy paid their first month's lease payment on the day it was due, then the second, then the third. It wasn't easy, living together. There were adjustments. Tammy and I had to learn how to share a kitchen, which is harder than it sounds. Patrick was stressed for a long time. There were evenings where the tension in the house was something you could feel without touching it. But there were also Saturday mornings when my grandson would come and sit in the kitchen while I had my coffee and tell me everything he'd dreamed about the night before, which was usually something involving dinosaurs and race cars, and those mornings were worth a great deal. The debt isn't gone. It'll take them years to work through it properly, but the calls from collectors have stopped. Patrick got a better job in the spring, a management position he wouldn't have had the bandwidth to pursue if he'd been in crisis mode. They're talking about a plan, a real one, with a timeline and targets. Last Sunday, Patrick came and sat at the kitchen table while I had my coffee and my grandson was still asleep upstairs. He didn't say much at first. Then he said, "I was really angry at you." I said, "I know." He said, "I think I'm starting to understand it." I didn't say anything back. I just poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the table. That felt like enough. Helen would have been glad about the coffee, I think. She always said the right conversations happen when you're not trying too hard to have them. She was right about most things. I try to remember that. The green bean casserole recipe is still in the drawer by the stove. I made it again at Easter this year. My grandson had 2 helpings and asked me why green beans taste better this way, and I told him that some things just taste better when someone makes them with care. And he thought about that very seriously for a moment and then went back to his plate. That seemed like a reasonable answer to me. I still think about that Thursday evening in November when Patrick opened that manila folder on the table like he was presenting evidence. In a way, he was, just not the kind he thought. What I've come to understand is that the situation didn't begin with the debt. It began long before that, in small choices made quietly over years. A vacation charge to a card that never got paid down, a loan taken to cover another loan. None of those choices were dramatic. None of them felt like a turning point when they were happening. That's how these things work, not like a crash, but like water finding its way through a crack, slowly, until one day the wall gives. And I made my own quiet choices too. The week I spent going through those statements line by line wasn't just about the numbers. It was about deciding what kind of man I was going to be in that situation. Not what felt good in the moment, not what would make Thanksgiving dinner less tense. What was actually right. That distinction between what's comfortable and what's correct is one I've had to make several times in my life, and it never gets easier. You don't get a version of it that doesn't cost something. Patrick is a good man. I want to be clear about that. He got into trouble the way a lot of people do, by wanting things before he built the foundation to hold them, and then not knowing how to stop. The mistake wasn't the debt. The mistake was believing the debt was someone else's problem to solve. That belief that love means someone absorbs your consequences is a kind thing to feel, maybe, but it doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up in finances, and it doesn't hold up in character. What I gave him at Christmas wasn't rejection. It was the first honest thing I could offer. The lease, the attorney's letter, Mrs. Okafor's projections, none of that was punishment. It was reality, written down with his name on it, which is different from reality ignored. Helen used to say that you can't protect someone from the weight of their own life. You can stand beside them while they carry it. That's different from carrying it for them. I didn't understand that fully when she said it, because when she was alive, I hadn't been tested on it the way I was later. Losing her taught me something about what remains when you stop pretending things are fine. What remained in our case was 31 years of choosing each other honestly, even when it was inconvenient. That was worth more than anything she could have left me in a will. I think about my grandson picking the bedroom with the window that faces the backyard. He didn't know anything about lease agreements or credit card settlements. He just knew that room had a good view. There is something in that I am still working out. The way the youngest among us move toward what they want, without apology, without shame, without the complicated machinery of debt and pride and expectation that the rest of us drag around. He's going to build his own machinery eventually. That's unavoidable. But I hope some part of what he sees in this house, two adults figuring out how to be honest with each other after a hard year, stays with him somewhere. The coffee I slid across the table to Patrick that Sunday morning was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness is a bigger word than what that moment was. What it was a beginning. Small and quiet, like most real things are.